My name is Alex Carter. I'm 47 years old, and for 25 of those years, I was a wildlife biologist. I spent my life in the woods, tracking, studying, and cataloging the animals that call the vast, untamed corners of North America home. I've tranquilized grizzly bears, tagged mountain lions, and spent weeks at a time completely isolated in environments that would send most people into a panic. I say this not to boast, but to establish a fact. I was not a man prone to flights of fancy. I was grounded in science, in observation, and in the hard, tangible reality of the natural world. What I knew from experience. What I saw, I recorded. What I couldn't explain, I investigated until I could. That was my life. That was who I was before Thornfield Creek. The cabin wasn't mine. It belonged to my friend Jake's family, a relic from the 50s built by his grandfather with timber felled on the property. It was located in the deepest part of the Thornfield State Forest, at the end of a long, rutted gravel road that was impassable for half the year. We went up there every autumn, a tradition that stretched back over a decade. It was our escape from the world, a place of quiet camaraderie, cheap whiskey, and the crisp, clean air of the deep woods. This particular trip was supposed to be a special one. It was the first time Jake was bringing along his younger cousin Brian and Brian's new girlfriend Megan. We also invited Corey, a friend from my college days who had done 2 tours with the Marines and now ran a private security firm. It was a bigger group than usual, but the cabin could sleep 8, so we had plenty of room. We arrived on a Thursday afternoon in late October. The air was already sharp with the promise of winter, and the aspen trees that lined the final stretch of the road were a brilliant, almost violent shade of yellow. The cabin sat in a small clearing overlooking Thornfield Creek, a fast-moving ribbon of water that cut through the valley. It was a sturdy 2-story structure of dark, weathered logs, with a wide porch and a stone chimney that puffed a welcoming plume of smoke, courtesy of Jake, who had driven up a day early to get the place opened up. He was standing on the porch when we pulled up, a grin on his face, a beer in his hand. He was a big man, Jake, with a calm, capable demeanor that was always reassuring in the backcountry. Brian and Megan were a stark contrast. Brian was full of a restless, city-bred energy, cracking jokes and filming everything on his phone. He clearly thought of this as a quaint little adventure, a rustic getaway. Megan was quiet and visibly uncomfortable with the sheer remoteness of it all. She kept her eyes wide, scanning the dense tree line that pressed in on all sides of the clearing, as if expecting something to leap out at any moment. Corey, on the other hand, was completely at ease. He moved with a quiet economy of motion, his eyes taking in everything with a practiced, analytical gaze. He unloaded his gear, a high-end rifle case, a heavy-duty pack, and a steel footlocker, with the same methodical efficiency he applied to everything in his life. That first evening was exactly as it should have been. We unpacked, settled in, and Jake cooked up a massive pot of chili on the old wood stove. We sat around the heavy oak table, the warm glow of the kerosene lamps pushing back the encroaching darkness. Brian told loud, exaggerated stories about his job in marketing. Megan sipped her wine and offered polite smiles, and Corey quietly cleaned his rifle, occasionally interjecting with a dry, witty comment. Jake and I mostly listened, content to be back in a place that felt more like home than our actual houses. The only sounds were our voices, the crackle of the fire, and the distant murmur of the creek. It was peaceful. It was normal. It was the last time I would ever feel that kind of peace again. The first wrong thing happened later that night. We had all turned in around 11. I was in one of the small upstairs bedrooms, the window cracked open just enough to let in the cold night air. I was drifting off to sleep when I heard it. It was a sound that didn't belong. It wasn't an animal I recognized, not a coyote, not a bear, not an owl. It was a deep, rhythmic knocking sound. 3 distinct knocks, a pause, then 3 more. Thump, thump, thump. Silence. Thump, thump,
thump. It sounded like someone striking a large tree with a heavy piece of wood, and it was coming from the far side of the creek, deep in the woods. I sat up in my cot, listening. My first thought was, another hunter, maybe lost or signaling. But it was well after midnight, and the sound was too consistent, too deliberate. It had a measured, almost intelligent cadence to it.
I got out of bed and went to the window, peering out into the inky blackness. I couldn't see anything but the faint silhouettes of the pines against a star-dusted sky. The knocking continued for another minute, then stopped as abruptly as it had begun. The silence that rushed back in felt heavier, more profound than before. I stood there for a long time, straining my ears, but there was nothing. I tried to rationalize it. A woodpecker, maybe, although I'd never heard one that loud or at that time of night. Falling branches, perhaps, though the rhythm was too perfect. I eventually crawled back into bed, but sleep didn't come easily. An unidentifiable sound in the woods is a question mark, and my mind is built to solve them. This one felt different. It felt wrong. The next morning, I brought it up over breakfast. Jake had heard it too. He was sitting at the table, nursing a cup of coffee, his brow furrowed. "Sounded like someone banging a baseball bat against a tree," he said, his voice low. Corey, who had been listening intently, nodded. "The timing was too regular for it to be natural," he added. 3 knocks, 5-second pause, 3 knocks, repeated 6 times. Then it stopped. Of course Corey had timed it. Brian, however, just laughed it off. "It's probably just some local yokel trying to scare the city folk," he said, winking at Megan. "Bigfoot's mating call or something." He made a goofy howling sound, and Megan forced a small laugh, though her eyes still looked worried. I didn't say anything else, but I shared a look with Jake. We both knew the woods. We knew the difference between a normal sound and something that raised the hair on your arms. Later that day, Jake, Corey, and I decided to take a walk, leaving Brian and Megan at the cabin. We crossed the creek on a series of slick, moss-covered stones and headed in the direction of the sounds from the previous night. We were ostensibly scouting for deer sign, but we were all looking for the source of the knocking. The woods on this side of the creek were older, denser. The canopy was so thick that the forest floor was in a perpetual twilight. It was quiet. Too quiet. That was the second wrong thing. There were no birds chirping, no squirrels chattering in the branches. The usual background noise of the forest was completely absent. It was an unnatural, listening silence, the kind that precedes a predator's attack. We found the tree about a half-mile in. It was a massive, old-growth pine, and the bark on one side was stripped away in a section about 7 feet off the ground. The exposed wood was battered and splintered, covered in fresh gouges. Whatever had made the marks had struck the tree with incredible force, but there were no footprints around the base of the tree, at least not that we could clearly identify. The ground was a thick carpet of pine needles and damp earth, but it was strangely undisturbed. Corey knelt, examining the marks. "Too high for a buck rub," he said, running a hand over the splintered wood. "And the impacts are too concentrated. Looks more like blunt force trauma." He stood up and scanned the surrounding woods. "Whatever did this is big and strong." We found the tracks about 50 yards from the tree. They weren't in a clear patch of mud, but pressed into a bed of moss, which was why we almost missed them. There were only 2 of them, but it was enough. My blood ran cold. The print was huge, at least 16 inches long, and vaguely humanoid, but wrong. It had a distinct heel and 5 toes, but the proportions were stretched, elongated. The most disturbing part was the deep impression of what looked like claws at the end of each toe. It was a bipedal track, but it wasn't human, and it certainly wasn't a bear. A bear print is distinct, asymmetrical, and this was not that. This was something else entirely. Jake just stared at it, his face pale. "What the hell makes a track like that?" he whispered. I didn't have an answer. I took out my phone and snapped several pictures from different angles, my hands shaking slightly. My biologist brain was screaming that this was impossible. No known animal in North America left a print like that. We tried to rationalize it, of course. We stood there in the dead, silent woods, staring at this impossible footprint, and we tried to make it fit into the world we knew. "Maybe it's a bear with a deformity," Jake suggested, but his voice lacked conviction. "Walking on its hind legs?" Corey countered, his skepticism sharp. "For how long? And the morphology is all wrong." I considered a hoax. Someone with a pair of carved wooden feet trying to scare people. But why? Why come all the way out here, to one of the most remote places in the state, to carve up a tree and stamp a couple of fake footprints in the moss where almost no one would ever see them? It didn't make sense. The effort was too great for a prank with no audience. We found no other tracks. The trail just seemed to vanish. We circled the area for an hour, but found nothing more. The silence remained, heavy and oppressive. We headed back to the cabin, the easy mood of the trip now completely gone, replaced by a cold knot of apprehension in my stomach. When we got back, Brian was on the porch, trying to teach Megan how to skip stones across the creek. He saw our faces and his grin faltered. "Whoa, you guys look like you've seen a ghost." "Find your Bigfoot?" he asked, trying to keep the tone light. Jake just shook his head and walked past him into the cabin. I showed Brian the picture on my phone. He stared at it, his smug expression slowly dissolving into confusion. "What is that? A bear?" he asked. "We don't think so," I said. "The track is from something walking on two legs." Megan came over and peered at the phone, her eyes widening in fear. "You're kidding, right? This is a joke." Brian put an arm around her, his bravado returning. "Come on, guys. It's probably just some weirdo hermit living out here. Alex, you're the biologist. You know there's a rational explanation for everything." I wished I could believe him, but the biologist in me was the part that was most terrified. The biologist in me knew that the thing that made that track was not in any of my textbooks. That night, the atmosphere in the cabin was thick with unspoken tension. Corey systematically checked every door and window, ensuring they were locked. He propped a heavy wooden chair under the knob of the main door. Brian tried to lighten the mood by putting on some music, but the cheerful songs sounded jarring and out of place. We ate dinner mostly in silence. Afterward, no one felt much like talking. We sat around the fire, each lost in our own thoughts. I kept going over the evidence in my head. The unnatural silence, the rhythmic knocking, the battered tree, the impossible footprint. It was a sequence of events that pointed toward something large, intelligent, and territorial. And we were in its territory. The direct interaction started around 10 o'clock. We were all in the main room when we heard a heavy scraping sound from outside, dragging along the logs of the back wall, the one that faced the dense woods. It was the sound of something hard, like claws, being drawn deliberately across the timber. Megan let out a small gasp and moved closer to Brian. We all froze, listening. The scraping stopped, and then we heard a soft, inquisitive sniffing sound right at the kitchen window. It was loud, wet, and guttural. It sounded like a very large dog, but the window was a good 6 feet off the ground. Corey held up a hand, signaling for silence. He crept toward the window, his movements fluid and silent. He peeked through a gap in the curtains, then recoiled so fast he almost fell over. His face was ashen. "What is it?" Jake whispered, his hand already on the shotgun he kept propped by the fireplace. Corey just shook his head, his eyes wide with a look I had never seen on his face before. Pure, undiluted shock.
There's something out there, he breathed. Big. I couldn't see it clearly. Just a shape. A head. It was looking right at the window. The sniffing sound came again, this time at the front door. A deep, resonant inhale, followed by a low growl that vibrated through the floorboards. It wasn't the growl of a bear or a wolf. It was deeper, more guttural, filled with a kind of resonant malice that made my teeth ache. Then the doorknob began to turn, slowly, deliberately, back and forth. The brass rattled in its housing. Whatever was outside was testing the door. It was looking for a way in. It knew what a doorknob was. Brian finally snapped. His skepticism shattered, replaced by a rising panic. "What the hell is that? Is it a bear?" he stammered, his voice trembling. "Bears don't turn doorknobs, Brian," Corey said, his voice deadly calm as he chambered around in his rifle. The sound of the bolt sliding home was unnervingly loud in the tense silence. The thing outside pushed against the door. The thick oak groaned, the frame straining against the force. It was a solid, probing pressure, not a frantic scrabbling. It was testing a weakness. This wasn't some dumb animal. This was an intelligent predator. The pressure on the door eased, and for a moment there was silence. Then a new sound. A soft, plaintive whimpering. It sounded like a small child, crying just outside on the porch. "Help me, please," a thin, reedy voice whispered. Megan covered her mouth, her eyes flooding with tears. "Oh my God, there's a child out there," she sobbed. Brian started to move toward the door. "We have to help them." Corey grabbed his arm, his grip like iron. "No," he commanded, his eyes fixed on the door. "That's not a child." The voice came again, more insistent this time, the whimpering escalating into a desperate cry. It was a perfect mimicry, designed to prey on the most basic of human instincts. But there was something hollow about it, something not quite right in the pitch and cadence. It was a recording played by something that didn't understand the emotion behind the sound. It was a lure. The mimicry stopped, replaced by a frustrated, guttural snarl. Then came the first real impact. Something slammed into the side of the cabin with the force of a car crash.
The whole structure shuddered, and glasses rattled on the shelves. It hit the wall again and again, each blow punctuated by a deep, enraged roar. This was no longer a test. This was a full-blown assault. We were trapped. We were being besieged by something we couldn't identify and couldn't comprehend. The fear I'd felt before was nothing compared to the stark, primal terror that now had me in its grip. This wasn't just a cryptid sighting. This was a hunt, and we were the prey. We spent the next hour in a state of high alert, listening as the creature circled the cabin. We'd hear it on the porch, then the heavy tread of its footsteps in the gravel on the side, then the scraping at the back wall again. It was relentless, methodical. It was examining our fortress, looking for a way in. At one point, we heard a loud crash from outside.
Corey and Jake ran to the side window. "The generator," Jake said, his voice grim. "It smashed the generator." The single bare bulb that had been illuminating the main room flickered and died, plunging us into the dim, wavering light of the kerosene lamps. The darkness felt like a physical presence, pressing in on us. Around midnight, Brian had his breaking point. He had been pacing back and forth, getting more agitated by the minute. The sounds from outside had stopped for about 20 minutes, and the silence was, if anything, more nerve-wracking than the noise. "I can't take this," he finally burst out. "It's probably gone. It was just an animal, and we scared it off." "It's not gone," Corey said without looking at him. "It's waiting. It's smart." "Smart? It's a damn bear."
Brian shouted, his voice cracking. "I'm not going to sit in here and wait for it to come back. I'm making a run for the truck." We all tried to talk him down. Jake pleaded with him, telling him it was suicide. Megan was sobbing, begging him to stay. But he wouldn't listen. His fear had curdled into a reckless, desperate bravado. "It's 50 yards to the truck," he said, grabbing his keys. "I can make it. We can get out of here." Before any of us could stop him, he unlatched the back door, the one leading to the small utility porch, and bolted into the darkness. The scream was immediate and horrifying. It was cut off with a sickening, wet, crunching sound. Megan shrieked, a raw animal sound of pure terror. Jake lunged for the door Brian had left open, but Corey slammed it shut just as a huge, dark shape filled the frame. "Don't look," Corey yelled, throwing his weight against the door as something immense slammed into it from the other side. But I had already seen it. It was only for a second, a fleeting glimpse in the faint moonlight, but it was burned into my memory forever. It was impossibly tall, easily over 7 feet, with a lean, muscular build that was grotesquely disproportionate. Its shoulders were massive, far too wide for its narrow waist. Its arms were long, hanging almost to its knees, and ended in large, human-like hands tipped with thick, black claws. Its legs were bent backward like a dog's at the knee joint, allowing it to move in a low, predatory crouch. And its head? Its head was the stuff of nightmares. It was the long, narrow head of a gigantic canine, like a wolf or a shepherd, but set atop a humanoid torso. Its fur was short and dark, matted with what looked like mud and pine needles. But the worst part was its eyes. For that one brief second, it looked right at me. They were intelligent, and they glowed with a faint yellow-green luminescence. And they were filled with a cold, hateful, predatory intelligence. That was the moment my world broke. The rational, scientific framework I had used to understand my life shattered into a million pieces. The creature in the woods was real. The monster was at the door. It slammed against the back door again, the wood splintering. Corey was shouting orders. "Jake, barricade this door! Alex, get the windows!" We moved on pure adrenaline. Jake and I dragged the heavy oak dining table and wedged it against the back door. Corey was at the front window, his rifle up, scanning the darkness. Megan was huddled in a corner, rocking back and forth, her cries reduced to a choked, rhythmic whimpering. The creature let out a roar of frustration, and we heard it move away from the back of the cabin. For a few minutes, there was silence again. "Where did it go?" Jake whispered, his knuckles white as he gripped his shotgun. "It's circling," Corey replied, his voice strained. "It's looking for another weak point." As if on cue, a rock crashed through one of the upstairs windows. The sound of shattering glass was followed by a triumphant, barking howl from outside. "It's trying to get in upstairs," I yelled. Corey didn't hesitate. "Jake, stay here. Cover the main floor. Alex, with me." We scrambled up the narrow, creaking staircase, my heart pounding in my chest. The upstairs was a small landing with 2 bedrooms on either side. The window in the room I had been using was smashed, and cold night air was pouring in. We could hear it, climbing, the sickening sound of claws scraping against the log walls, finding purchase. It was agile. It was strong. Corey took up a position by the door of the bedroom, aiming his rifle at the broken window. "It's going to come through there," he said. "When it does, I'm going to put as many rounds into it as I can. You be ready to back me up." I stood behind him, my own hunting rifle feeling like a toy in my hands. We waited. The scraping grew louder, closer. A large, clawed hand appeared in the window frame, gripping the sill. Then another.
the massive head and shoulders pulled into view, silhouetted against the night sky.
It was even bigger than I had thought. It filled the entire window frame. Its glowing yellow eyes scanned the room, and its long snout wrinkled as it sniffed the air, its lips pulling back to reveal a row of long yellow fangs. A low growl rumbled in its chest. Corey fired. The roar of the rifle in the enclosed space was deafening. He fired 3 shots in quick succession. The creature recoiled with a scream of pain and rage, a sound that was half wolf, half human. It thrashed wildly, one of its long arms swiping through the window and tearing a huge chunk of the wall out. Wood and plaster exploded into the room. It wasn't down, it was just angry. It lunged forward, trying to force its massive shoulders through the window frame. Corey fired again, but the creature swatted at the rifle with astonishing speed. The weapon was torn from Corey's grasp and sent clattering across the floor.
Before he could react, one of its long arms shot through the broken window, seized him by the front of his jacket, and yanked him forward. Corey was a strong man, but he was lifted off his feet like a child's doll. He was pulled against the window frame with bone-crushing force. I heard his ribs crack. He let out a choked cry as the creature's claws dug into his chest. It was trying to pull him through the window. I raised my rifle and fired, aiming for the head, but in the chaos and the dim light, my shot went wide, splintering the window frame next to its ear. The creature roared in my direction, distracted for a split second. It was the only chance Corey had. With a surge of adrenaline, he drew the large combat knife he always carried on his belt and plunged it deep into the creature's forearm. The thing shrieked, a high-pitched, piercing sound of agony, and its grip loosened for a moment. Corey fell back into the room, gasping for air, blood pouring from deep gouges in his chest. The creature withdrew its arm from the window, and we heard it drop from the side of the cabin, landing with a heavy thud on the ground below. It was still alive. We could hear it circling the cabin again, its howls of pain and rage echoing through the valley. I dragged Corey away from the window, back toward the landing. He was breathing in ragged, shallow gasps. "It's smart," he wheezed, clutching his chest. It knew the rifle was the threat. Downstairs, Jake was yelling, asking what had happened. "Corey's hit," I yelled back. "It tried to come through the window." We had a brief respite. I helped Corey downstairs and we laid him on the sofa. Megan, seeing his injuries, seemed to be shocked out of her catatonia. She had some first aid training and immediately went to work, trying to staunch the bleeding with towels from the kitchen. The wounds were deep. It was bad. Jake stood guard at the front door, his face a grim mask. "We're not going to survive the night in here," he said, his voice flat. "It's going to keep trying until it gets in. And with Corey down, we're in real trouble." He was right. The cabin was no longer a fortress. It was a trap. Our only hope was to get to the truck. Brian had been wrong about being able to make it, but he had been right that it was our only way out. The creature seemed to be of the same mind. We heard a new sound from outside, a rhythmic, metallic creaking, followed by a loud snap. Jake looked out the front window. "Oh, you have got to be kidding me," he muttered. I went to look. In the moonlight, I could see the creature. It was standing next to Jake's pickup truck. It had its hands on the front fender and was rocking the heavy vehicle back and forth. With a final tremendous shove, it tipped the truck over onto its side. Then, with what looked like casual ease, it ripped the driver's side door off its hinges and threw it into the woods. Our escape was gone. It had neutralized our vehicle. It was thinking tactically. It was isolating us, breaking us down. Helplessness is a cold, heavy thing. It settles in your bones and leaches the strength from your limbs. We were trapped in a box, miles from civilization, being hunted by something that shouldn't exist, something that was smarter and stronger than any of us. Corey was fading. His breathing was getting shallower. Megan was doing her best, but he needed a doctor, a hospital. We were running out of time. And then
As if things couldn't get worse, we heard a new sound. It was the same barking howl as before, but this time it was answered by another one farther down the creek, and then a third from the ridge line above the cabin. It hadn't been alone. It had called for its pack. That was the turning point.
The moment when the fight for survival became a desperate, hopeless flight. "They're going to tear this place apart," Jake said, his voice barely a whisper. "We have to run. Now." "Run where?" I asked. "The truck is gone." "Into the woods," he said. "Follow the creek downstream. It's our only chance. They'll be focused on the cabin. We might be able to slip out the back." It was a crazy plan. Running into the pitch-black woods that were now home to at least 3 of those things seemed like a death sentence. But staying in the cabin was a guaranteed one. Corey looked up at us. "Go," he rasped. "Don't. Wait for me. I'll slow you down." He pushed his rifle into Jake's hands. "Take this. You'll need it." Megan started to protest, tears streaming down her face, but Corey just shook his head. "Get her out of here, Alex. That's an order." Leaving him was the hardest thing I've ever done. It felt like a profound betrayal. But he was right. He couldn't move, and we couldn't carry him and run. Staying with him would have meant all of us dying. We took his rifle, a spare magazine, and the small backpack with our remaining water and a first aid kit. Jake went to the back door and slowly, carefully, began to remove the barricade. I took Megan by the arm. She was trembling uncontrollably, but she was on her feet. "I'm not leaving him," she whispered. "You have to," I said, my voice harsher than I intended. "We have to go, now." I looked back at Corey one last time. He gave me a weak, grim nod. He knew what he was doing. He was buying us time. Jake got the door open a crack. The night air was cold and smelled of pine and damp earth. There was no sign of the creatures at the back of the cabin. They were circling, probably coordinating, getting ready for their final assault. "Now," Jake whispered. "Stay low and don't make a sound." We slipped out the back door one by one into the oppressive darkness. We moved in a crouch, heading for the cover of the tree line at the edge of the clearing. Every snap of a twig underfoot sounded like a gunshot. My senses were on fire. I could hear every rustle of leaves, see every shadow move in my peripheral vision. We made it to the trees, our backs pressed against the rough bark of a pine, and looked back at the cabin. Lights were still on inside, the faint, warm glow of the kerosene lamps. It looked peaceful from a distance. Then, the front window exploded inward as one of the creatures launched itself through. We heard Corey yell, followed by the sound of his handgun firing. 2 shots, then a third. Then the sound of a terrible struggle and a final, choked-off scream. The other 2 creatures converged on the cabin, tearing at the walls and the roof, their howls of triumph echoing in the night. They were distracted. It was our chance. Corey had bought us our window. We ran. We didn't look back. We plunged into the woods, following the sound of the creek. It was a nightmare flight through a black, hostile landscape. Branches whipped at our faces, and unseen roots threatened to trip us at every step. Jake was in the lead, using Corey's rifle to push aside brush. I was behind him, practically dragging Megan, who was stumbling and sobbing. The sounds from the cabin faded behind us, replaced by the roar of the creek and the frantic pounding of our own hearts. I had no idea if we were putting enough distance between us and them. I just knew we had to keep moving. We ran for what felt like hours. My lungs burned, and my legs were screaming in protest. We were exhausted, terrified, and running on pure adrenaline. At one point, Megan tripped and fell hard, twisting her ankle. She cried out in pain. "I can't go on," she sobbed. "Just leave me." Jake and I hauled her to her feet. "No one else is getting left behind," Jake growled, his voice fierce. He was a good man.
the best I knew.
He slung her arm over his shoulder, taking most of her weight, and we pushed on. Our pace now slowed to a painful, stumbling limp. We heard them again an hour before dawn. A long, mournful howl, much closer than we had expected. They were hunting us. They had finished with the cabin and picked up our trail. Panic gave us a fresh burst of energy. We pushed harder, ignoring the pain, ignoring the exhaustion. The terrain was getting steeper, the woods thicker. We could hear them crashing through the undergrowth behind us, getting closer. They were faster than us, much faster. They were toying with us, herding us. Dawn was just beginning to break, painting the eastern sky in shades of gray and purple, when we came to a small cliff overlooking the creek. It was about a 20-foot drop to a rocky bank below. There was no way to climb down. We were cornered. The sounds of our pursuers were right behind us, just beyond the trees. We could hear their guttural, huffing breaths. "This is it," Jake said, turning to face the trees, raising the rifle. "Get behind me, both of you." He was going to make a last stand. He was going to die for us. But as the first rays of direct sunlight broke over the ridge and sliced through the trees, the sounds stopped. The crashing in the brush ceased. The huffing breaths went silent. We stood there on the edge of the cliff for a full minute, listening. There was nothing. Just the sound of the creek below and the first tentative chirps of morning birds. It was as if the creatures had simply vanished. "They're gone," I whispered, not daring to believe it. "The sun," Jake said, his eyes scanning the trees. "Maybe they don't like the light." It was the only explanation that made any sense. The arrival of dawn had saved us. We found a way down the cliff further along the ridge and stumbled our way along the creek for another 2 miles before we hit an old logging road. We followed that road for what felt like an eternity, until we finally saw the glint of sunlight on pavement. We had reached a highway. We collapsed on the shoulder of the road, utterly spent. The first car that came by, a pickup truck driven by an old farmer, screeched to a halt. The look on his face when he saw us, covered in mud and blood, clothes torn, faces etched with horror, was something I'll never forget. He drove us to the nearest town, to the sheriff's office. Our story came out in a jumbled, incoherent mess. We talked about the cabin, the sounds, the attack. We told them about Brian, about Corey. The 2 deputies on duty just looked at each other, their faces a mixture of pity and disbelief. They sent a car out to the cabin. We spent the rest of the day at the station, giving our statements over and over again. Megan was taken to the hospital to be treated for her ankle and for shock. The official report came out 2 days later. It was a masterpiece of dismissive bureaucracy. The destruction at the cabin, the deaths of Brian and Corey, were all attributed to a unusually aggressive black bear, possibly rabid. Brian's body, or what was left of it, had been found in the woods behind the cabin. Corey's remains were inside. The report stated he had likely been killed when the bear broke into the cabin. The flipped truck was explained away as Brian panicking and crashing it in the dark. Our account of intelligent, tool-using, bipedal creatures was noted in the appendix as a symptom of group hysteria brought on by a traumatic animal attack. They didn't believe a word we said. We were just 3 traumatized survivors whose minds had played tricks on them. We had no proof. My phone, with the picture of the footprint, had been lost during the run through the woods. The deputies who investigated the site claimed the ground was too churned up to find any clear tracks. It was our word against the comfortable, rational explanation. And the rational explanation always wins. The case was closed. A week later, as I was preparing to leave town, one of the older deputies, a man nearing retirement, pulled me aside in the parking lot of the motel.
He looked around nervously before he spoke. "I read your full statement," he said, his voice low. "The unedited one." I just nodded, too tired to argue anymore. He sighed and looked out toward the mountains. "You're not the first," he said. "Over the years, we've had a dozen reports like yours from up in that valley. People go missing. Hunters find strange tracks. We get stories. Stories you don't put in the official reports." He looked me in the eye. "My advice to you? Go home. Forget what you saw. And never, ever go back to Thornfield Creek. There are things in those woods that don't have names, and the best you can do is stay the hell away from them." He clapped me on the shoulder and walked away, leaving me standing there with his unofficial, terrifying validation.
I took his advice. I went home, but I couldn't forget. How could I? I quit my job. I couldn't stand to be in the woods anymore. The peace I once found there was gone, replaced by a constant, gnawing fear. Every shadow looks like a predator. Every sound at night is a threat. Jake and I don't see each other much anymore. The memory of that night is a wall between us. We share a truth that we can't speak of to anyone else, and it has isolated us. Megan moved away. I heard she had a complete breakdown and spent 6 months in a psychiatric facility. I can't blame her. Sometimes I lie awake at night and I see those glowing yellow eyes. I see that impossible canine head on that man-like body. I remember the intelligence in its gaze, the cold malice. I live with the knowledge that the world is not what we think it is. The maps are wrong. There are still dark corners, places where evolution took a different path. We live in a brightly lit room, convinced it's the whole world, but just outside the door, in the darkness, monsters are real. My name is Alex Carter. I am a survivor, but I am also a ghost. I am haunted by the men we lost, by the friend who sacrificed himself for us, and by the terrible knowledge of what lives in the deep woods. So if you ever find yourself in a place where the woods are too quiet, where you find a track you can't identify, don't be a scientist. Don't be a skeptic. Don't be brave. Turn around and run. Run and don't look back. Because some things are not meant to be discovered. They're meant to be survived. And not everyone is so lucky.